Can I find your podcast?
And now, a look at this week in podcasting news. It's the JAG Show podcast.
First off, happy Mardi Gras to everybody in Louisiana. I may be a native of Massachusetts and an adopted Michigander, but I really do miss y'all around this time of year. Laissez, temps, rouler. Okay, back to my main point of today's podcast. Can your podcast be found? Now, what the word podcast is can be different things to different people, but what those folks think doesn't matter. What matters is what the consumers think is a podcast. The two big podcast apps are still Apple and Spotify. So if you tell me you've got a podcast, those are the two places that I'm going to go to first look for them. However, YouTube becoming a major third player in this realm. So while it might not technically be a podcast if it's on YouTube, people are finding podcasts and consuming podcasts on YouTube. Keep in mind, Google owns YouTube. How many times have you Googled how to do something and you get YouTube in the results? Your podcast should also be on YouTube. The bottom line is this. If you tell someone you have a podcast, they're going to look for you wherever they consume their podcast content. So if you want to be found, don't be where you want to be and what you just think is a podcast. Be where your audience can find you. Other podcasting news this week, Spotify has acquired third-party measuring services Chartable and Pod Sites. That did raise a few eyebrows around the podcasting community. It would be kind of like if iHeartMedia bought Nielsen ratings, which hasn't happened at least yet. As Brian Barletta of Sounds Profitable says, grading your own homework is not third-party measurement, so keep an eye out for that. Maybe Spotify is still just continuing to generate headlines as opposed to content to keep the stockholders happy. As James Cridland of Pod News points out, they've announced shows with everybody from Meghan and Harry to Kim Kardashian and more, but none of them have actually launched. He actually has a full list of all these shows that have been promised but not yet delivered on Pod News. There's a link to that in today's show notes. And of course, the situation in Ukraine has affected the podcast world. Podcast live streaming service Restream had to relocate its staff out of Ukraine. They did make a donation to the Ukrainian Red Cross, though. And if you want a deep dive of the conflict, of course, there is a podcast for that. The BBC has launched the Ukraine Cast. It is linked in today's show notes as well. Funny when you think about it, how Vladimir Putin has spent the last 6 years trying to divide us as a nation. What he's done over the last week has brought us together and agreeing on something in a way which we haven't agreed on something in a long time. Of course, thinking of everybody involved in that situation. Until next time, stay healthy and stay safe. Later.
Thanks for listening to the JAG Show podcast. For help with your podcast, find JAG on the web at jagindetroit.com.